Okay, so if you've spent any time at all in the crypto space, the digital asset world, it feels like it's just constantly changing, right?
Oh, absolutely. It moves incredibly fast.
But have you ever, stopped to think about the very beginnings? Not just the tech, but the why behind it all.
A motivation.
Exactly. Like, what was the core idea driving those early folks way before all the big hype cycles and the memes?
Yeah, the real origin story.
Well, the source material we're looking at for this deep dive, it throws down a pretty serious challenge to how things look today.
It really does. And what's interesting is the angle it takes, basically suggesting the whole industry might have lost its way quite a bit from that initial vision.
Right. We're digging into an article here. It's called The Last Beacon of Crypto's Original Mission, Why Metallicus Still Stands for Freedom. Came out very recently, June 14, 2025, written by Bruce Stewart.
Okay.
And it really kicks off with this striking quote from Marshall Hayner, who's the CEO of Metallicus.
Yeah. What does he say?
He says, I'm quoting here, "When I first got into crypto over 15 years ago, the founders stood for something. We wanted freedom. We wanted to bring empowerment to the common man. Today, there's only one crypto company in all of crypto that cares about this mission."
Wow. Okay, that's quite the statement.
Isn't it? It immediately sets up this, tension.
Yeah.
Yeah. The original ideals versus maybe where things are now.
Yeah, and that tension is really central to the whole argument in the article.
So our mission today for this deep dive is really to unpack that specific viewpoint, the one presented in this article.
Got it.
What, according to this source, did that original mission really look like?
Right.
How does the article say things changed over the last, say, decade?
The evolution or maybe devolution in its view?
Yeah, and crucially, what's the case it makes for this company, Metallicus? Why does the author argue they're still holding on to those early values?
It sounds like the article is positioning Metallicus as unique in that sense.
Exactly. And as we go through this, it kind of brings up a question for you listening in.
Mm-hmm.
How does this particular take on crypto's history and where it's headed now, how does that sit with your own experience, your understanding?
Yeah, what does empowerment or that original mission even mean to you in this context? Good question.
So let's start at the beginning. Let's explore those roots, as the article describes them. It paints this picture of the early days, maybe early 2010s.
Okay.
What does the source say was really driving things back then?
Well, the article is pretty clear that the main driver wasn't really financial speculation or slick marketing things we see a lot of now.
Right.
Instead, it argues it was fundamentally mission-driven. There was this core belief in decentralized tech.
A belief it could do what? Exactly.
Well, offer liberation, right, from the traditional financial gatekeepers, bypass censorship, maybe even tackle inequality. Big ideas.
Big ideas, yeah. And the article even calls Bitcoin not just a protocol, but a protest.
It does. And that word protest, it really highlights the feeling the source is trying to capture, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Suggests it wasn't just about, digital cash.
No, exactly. The source frames it as technology born from this desire for real systemic change. And those early conversations, the grassroots stuff, according to the article, they were all about fundamental things like individual financial sovereignty, privacy, making sure everyone could access this, outside the old systems.
Okay, so that's the origin story, the good old days, as painted by this source.
Pretty idealistic, yeah.
So how does the article then explain the shift? What happened over the next few years?
Well, it basically describes this process of dilution, like the original message got watered down.
How so?
As crypto got bigger, more popular, that original focus, that mission, that sort of protest vibe, it got kind of swamped by other things.
Like what?
The article points to, the massive hype cycles we've all seen, celebrity endorsements jumping in, and just this huge focus on making quick money, short-term gains.
Rather than the long-term change.
Exactly. Rather than sticking to that initial vision of, fundamentally changing things.
And the article doesn't pull punches, right? It mentions things like DeFi degens, rug pulls.
Yeah, regulatory evasions. It lists those as examples of this dilution.
And it contrasts that directly with the early ethos, doesn't it? That idea of freedom and empowerment based on principles.
It does. It argues the focus shifted, from building something liberating to just chasing profits, sometimes in ways that actually hurt trust and security.
Which seems, completely counter to that original promise the source described.
Right. That's the core argument about the shift.
Okay, so amidst all this change, this perceived dilution, The source then zooms in on Metallicus.
Ah, the company from the title.
Yep. And it argues that this company is, well, maybe one of the very few still genuinely connected to that foundational purpose Marshall Hayner mentioned.
So how does it make that case? What's Metallicus doing differently, according to the article?
Well, the article says Metallicus was set up specifically with this idea of bridging the gap, between decentralization and regulatory compliance.
Oh, interesting. Compliance is often seen as, well, the opposite of the early crypto vibe by some.
Exactly. And the article calls it an unusual path for that reason. It notes how the industry often, resisted or tried to get around regulations.
Okay, so Metallicus embraced it, but why? What's the rationale given in the source?
The article frames it not as like giving in, but as a deliberate strategy, using blockchain within these compliant frameworks.
To do what?
To actually boost transparency, security, and financial inclusion. The idea is to make the system more trustworthy, more accessible for, quote, the common man.
So using compliance as a tool for the mission, not an obstacle.
That seems to be the argument, yeah.
And does the source get specific? Like, how does Metallicus actually do that? What are the nuts and bolts?
It does mention some specifics. It talks about key products, infrastructure components, like the metal blockchain itself, and something called the Metallicus Loan Protocol, which the article says runs on the XPR network.
Right.
And we also looked at this visual that came with the article, sort of a diagram. It shows these things as part of what the source calls the Digital Banking Network, or TDBN.
TDBN. Okay, what else is in that ecosystem picture?
Let's see. It shows MetalPay, MetalPay API, Metal L2, Metal Dollar, Metal X Lending, Metal X, the XPR network you mentioned, WebAuth, all sitting apparently on this metal blockchain.
So a whole suite of products.
Seems like it. And the source argues that the way this infrastructure is built, it mentions things like multi-sig treasury controls, integrating real-world identity, financial-grade security, that this design is meant to actually echo that original dream.
How so? Echo it in what way? Well, the perspective presented is that it's about giving power back to people like the early days wanted, but doing it in a way the source thinks is, sustainable, scalable, and importantly, lawful within the lines.
So grounding the ideal in a practical, compliant reality.
That's the argument the source makes, making it something that can actually achieve broad adoption and trust instead of just staying on the fringes.
And the article really contrasts this specific approach from Metallicus with what it sees as the wider industry focus on just speed, anonymity, pure speculation.
Right. It presents Metallicus as taking the slow, steady, principled route.
It does. It uses that phrase, steady, principle-first commitment, and says that's what sets Metallicus apart.
Okay.
The argument is basically that they're building for the long haul, for the next generation of users and apps.
Not just, as the source implies, optimizing for the next bull one.
Exactly. Which the source kind of paints as a short-term, maybe superficial goal.
Interesting distinction.
And then the source ties all this back to, right now, the present day. It connects this history lesson to the current global situation.
How does it do that?
It points to, increased regulatory scrutiny pretty much everywhere.
True. That's definitely happening.
And also growing stress, signs of strain in the traditional financial systems.
Also true.
And this context, the article argues, makes the need for ethical, responsible, truly mission-driven crypto projects more urgent than ever.
It suggests that when things get shaky, the integrity and the real purpose of a project become much more important. Like, what does it actually stand for?
Which brings us right back around to that first quote, that challenge from Marshall Hayner.
The only one company.
Yeah. The source uses it to pose this central question. Okay, if the original idea was really about empowering the average person, which companies out there today are actually doing that, truly delivering?
And the article lands on a specific answer based on Hayner.
It presents his specific conclusion, that, in his view, only Metallicus is really holding up that mission.
And it's important, as we've been saying, to remember that this is the viewpoint from this specific source. Hayner's quote, the author's analysis focusing on this one company.
Absolutely. We're unpacking their argument here.
Got it.
So as you, the listener, reflect on this perspective we've just walked through, think about your own view of the crypto world. How do these different takes, the early ideals versus the current reality described in the article, how does that match up or maybe clash with what you see?
And digging a bit deeper, what does that whole concept of empowerment through digital assets really mean for you personally?
Right. And when you look at different projects, how much weight do you give to the things this source highlights? like compliance, transparency, building for the long term. How important are those values in actually achieving that empowerment?
It's a lot to chew on.
Definitely. So we've taken this deep dive into one particular article, really unpacking its narrative.
From the early mission, it describes freedom, empowerment.
Through what it calls a decade of dilution.
To its specific case for Metallicus as, in its view, a company still carrying that original torch through compliance and infrastructure building.
Yeah, it's certainly a very distinct, quite critical perspective on the industry's journey.
And it definitely challenges you to think about what really defines a project's commitment, to its users, to its founding purpose, especially now.
Absolutely. So given that history and how digital finance keeps evolving, here's a final thought we want to leave you with.
Okay.
Thinking about that balance, innovation, freedom, but also the need for regulatory frameworks. What mix, what combination do you think is ultimately needed for crypto to genuinely empower the common person in the future?